Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for all your work in your breakout sessions. Thank you to the NLC team. You will be getting more information over the next day and coming weeks from your breakouts, so stay tuned there. The next panel is a discussion on how you might engage the federal government for support in implementing your program, policy, or practice in general recovery from the crisis. We have three panelists, Ray Reynolds from Century Capital, Mark from the USDA, and Claudia Somm, formerly of the Fed and now an economic policy thought leader. Can we invite our panelists on, and I'm going to moderate this session. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Yep. Sorry, all right, there we go. Now I can see all. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ray, Mark, and Claudia. I guess let's just start this panel off with just a quick presentation from each of you to kind of give some background, some information about your perspective, about how mayors might engage the federal side of things to get support and funding for what they're implementing in their communities. Mark, why don't we start with you? Thank you, Mark.
Yes, and thank you. I'm glad to join this afternoon. Again, my name is Mark Brudzinski. I'm with the USDA Rural Development Mission Area. So I'm going to represent basically a suite of programs underneath the administered by the Rural Development Mission Area by three different agencies. It's the Rural Housing Service, the Rural Utility Service, and the Rural Business Cooperative Service. The latter, the Rural Business Cooperative Service, is actually where I basically spend most of my time right now, but a breadth of knowledge across all programs. So we'll touch base a little bit and provide maybe a little bit of insight as to what's available and hopefully have some robust conversations about it. First of all, to those of you that aren't familiar with rural development, again, we are a mission area within USDA. While we're part of USDA, we really don't focus on agriculture. We focus more on the needs and assistance to rural communities. First of all, our structure, we have a national structure of field offices. We have basically what we refer to as a state office in each of the states and area offices. And within that, really most of our programs are administered through our field office teams. So I would suggest as we're speaking here and rolling through, if anything out of this conversation, maybe it's just a very simple website, and it's rd.usda.gov. So RD as in rural development.usda.gov includes all the information, contact information, eligibility issues, program fact sheets, everything that we're going to briefly talk about today, but the details are much more available on our website. First of all, what is rural? Unfortunately, I can't answer that very easily because it varies. Being from three different agencies under one umbrella organization, we have different definitions of rural, and it depends a little bit as to where the programs originated and their purposes. But for the most part, many of our programs define rural as a city or village with a population of less than 50,000. In an urban area contiguous to cities that are larger than 50,000 would also be considered to be urban or not rural. So maybe what's what easier to understand is what's not eligible for most of our programs, and that is a core city of 50,000 or more population and the urban area around that. Now, some of our programs have a little bit other definitions, and we'll talk about that as we go through maybe the Q&A piece of it. But please keep in mind that even though we do focus on rural, we're not exclusive. We do have some programs that can assist in urban areas, such as local and regional food systems, agricultural producers, rural or urban ag systems, are some areas that we can work in, and a few other, exceptions as we roll through. I thought I'd talk just a couple of highlights with the COVID-19 pandemic and special programs. Within the Rural Development Mission Area, we have two programs that were supported by the original CARES Act. One is a guaranteed loan program. It focuses on businesses, but it's a guaranteed loan available to commercial lenders to assist rural businesses in working capital needs. We have about $1 billion available in that program. But when we wrote the regulations for that program, we defined business as an enterprise. So nonprofits and public entities that operate as an enterprise are also eligible for that program. So again, that's to help finance working capital, some recovery, and other responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in our rural utility programs, within our broadband reconnect program, the reconnect program also obtains some additional funding to help support the loan and grant programs administered through their efforts. I would also remind is don't forget about our standard programs. Within our housing programs, we have programs that support single-family homes, either direct loans or guaranteed loans for low-income and moderate-income families. Multifamily housing programs to support low-income and elderly in rental facilities. Community facility programs to help support infrastructure relating to could be healthcare, hospitals, education systems, fire and rescue, really any service provided by a community or a nonprofit. And last, our business programs. We do have some guaranteed loan programs and some revolving loan fund type programs. So the latter basically are programs where we provide funding to local economic development organizations, either public or nonprofit, to assist small and emerging businesses through revolving loan fund programs, technical assistance programs, business incubators, and others. So again, a wide suite of programs available through our agency and activities. I'd stop with that for an overview and hope for some additional discussion. Okay, thank you.
That was fantastic information, and it's good to know that there are programs out there outside of the COVID relief that we can leverage right now. I want to welcome Gary Cunningham to the panel. Thanks for joining us, Gary.
Thank you.
Yeah, Gary, why don't you just introduce yourself real briefly, who you are and what organization you're with?
Yes, my name is Gary Cunningham, and I'm president and CEO of Prosperity Now. Prosperity Now is really about how do we change conditions for low and moderate income people so they can fully participate in all aspects of our society. And I'm really glad to be here today. Thanks for having me, Evan. Appreciate it. And I was going to go ahead, really wanted to thank everybody for being here and really try to lay some context, if that's all right, Evan.
Of course.
Yes. So, one of the things that we do know is that we as a nation are facing some significant challenges right now with the COVID pandemic, an economic upheaval, and a consequential election that we're all looking at, and a reckoning on racial injustice. And this is particularly having huge impacts on our cities. The covenant and the relationship between the federal government and cities in particular, but local government altogether, really sets the stage for how can we rebuild after this crisis. So this panel really is to get at the question of how you as mayors can actually utilize the federal government in order to do contracting, in order to have relationships. The federal government last year spent $750 billion in grants to state and local governments. And the real question is how do you, as a city, take advantage of this in all kinds of areas, in just about every area that cities are operating in. So this panel is apropos. And so with that, we've already heard from Mark. I want to turn it over to Ray Ramsey. And Ray is an independent trustee and a member of the investment committee and an interim CEO at the Nathan Cummings Foundation. Ray, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience and what you bring to the table on this subject?
Sure. Well, I'm in an unusual time for me because, as you just gave that introduction, that's half of my life, and my other hat is the CEO of Century Capital, which is an impact investment platform. So I'm gonna morph and speak about both, because my whole thesis and what I want to say to the mayors and their representatives is the best pathway to accessing federal dollars is the same formula to access any dollars. And that is really to spend the time and to develop your vision for whether it's at the project level or at the city level, and taking stock of who you are in your municipality, what your assets are. So it starts with what I would call a situational analysis. What is the situation? What are your assets? Where are your primary soft spots? Because all of those will, quote, be exposed at some point. So whether it's an RFP or something else that's competitive, things are scored. And so the more data that you can bring and the openness to take that data, I often say to people, because I work with many municipalities, tell your story. What is the story of Atlanta? What is the story of Memphis? What is the story of your small town? And very often when you unpeel that, you begin to look at various assets. It could be that you have a lot of colleges there. It could be that you've got natural resources. So you want to turn that into a strength. And then the other concept is I talk about, converging different players to the table. And so one of the most important powers that anyone in local government has is the ability to convene. And so I often say, get the table right, convene the right people together with a focus on outcomes. What's the outcome that we're looking for in housing? What's the outcome that we're looking for in economic development? And then after you've worked through those things, then it's a process of looking at what's available. And so what I often counsel is, and there's natural that we'll chase certain dollars and certain pots, but very often it doesn't all come together in a coherent narrative. And one of the other things is that capital, whether it's from the federal government or from elsewhere, capital is all about creating leverage. So $1 and turning $1 into $3, that will make any application more competitive. So where do the other dollars come from? Where you've got two other big sources of capital that are actually leaning in and caring about what's going on in urban America. One is philanthropy, and I can talk more about what philanthropy is doing, because philanthropy is delighted when it can partner with the government. And so you're also going to do a good job of attracting the philanthropic dollars, even, my own, but what we look at Nathan Cummings. And then it is the private sector and the large new movement in putting capital in urban and rural America is the genre that's called impact investing. Because what does it look for? Societal impacts, outcomes. And so the work that you put in, thinking through the outcomes that you want to achieve, can be cut and paste and used again, whether you're applying for government money, philanthropic money, or the private sector. They all seek similar things. And in the impact world, it's seeking, to get a basic return, but it's also just seeking what are the outcomes? What's the thing? And I'll leave one other construct and we can talk more is, the other frame that I use is I call it the 3 I's. Imagine, so reimagine your situation, but use the imagination that you're uniquely positioned to have about who you are and the boldness of what you want to move forward with. And then think in terms of innovation. And innovation is not always about technology or about science. Very often it's in the repurposing of what you already do. So when you think about what's made possible, one of the things that happened during COVID, for example, were the reimbursement rates for a hospital visit. So now the telehealth reimbursement is exactly the same as the face-to-face. So who does that incentivize? Well, it should incentivize various parties to come together and be at that table that I was describing in ways that they might not have otherwise done because the reimbursement formula changed. And what is that? At the end of the day, that's a form of innovation. So very often innovation is about the adaptive uses of different things that already exist. And then think in terms of investing. Put yourself on the other side and say, what does that investor want to see? That investment partner could be the government, philanthropy, or the private sector. And if you can get all three together, it's a triple win.
Thank you, Ray, for that. That was very informative. I want to take a moment and introduce Claudia Sams, who is the Director of Microeconomic Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth and a contributor to Bloomberg Opinion. Claudia, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so first of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel. So my perspective as a macroeconomist and someone who's worked in economic policy in DC for a decade, both at the Federal Reserve I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, and now I'm at a think tank in DC, and I've done a lot of work with members and staff on the Hill, especially since March. So I don't bring the nuts and bolts, all these programs to apply to. That's absolutely important. I know the devil is always in the detail. I will say, because this is broadly about federal funding, I'm not here to bring sunshine and roses. I think you all know that the situation is really dire. From my perspective, as someone who follows economic conditions, we absolutely have a recovery that is stalled, and relief had worked. The CARES Act, trillions of dollars, this was good. I know money didn't get directly to state and local governments, and that's a tragedy, but the money helped. The money is running out or has completely expired, and that's putting us in this. A lot of families, the unemployed, small businesses, communities are suffering, and it's going to be a slog unless Congress does more. I'm not real encouraged. I really don't think you all should be counting on money from DC, especially before the election. Now, it could be proved wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But having watched the debate, especially since July, August, what's going on right now, as you know, the money to state and local governments gets mired in politics. I won't comment on that. I don't think we should be in this place. And I started at the Federal Reserve on the staff's macro forecast in July of 2007. So what I'm watching, the train wreck that I see today in terms of the massive budget shortfalls you all are facing, we saw this. This happened after the Great Recession. It had enormous consequences. As just one example, millions of teachers laid off, funding to community colleges, student debt rising. I mean, that's just one example, and that's one we pay for a long time. If you look at the numbers, they're like that, and if not worse. And this is not years into a recession and recovery. This is months. So this is really serious. I do think there are some opportunities for DC. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about Congress. The Problem Solvers Caucus has brought out a new proposal for $500 billion. That's less than the HEROES Act that was close to $1 trillion, but it's all greater than zero, which is kind of what we've been stuck at. So that's a possibility. Again, I wouldn't plan on that happening, but that could happen, and it should. The other is the Federal Reserve in this recession took steps to set up a municipal lending facility. This was authorized in the CARES Act. They had hundreds of billions of dollars to do this, and they have made a handful of loans, which is not good. And frankly, I'm really disappointed because this time the Fed was going to step in to directly save directly save Main Street, in addition to all of the work they've done to prop up Wall Street, which we need financial markets working. So I don't want to discount that. Their efforts this time to get money out to all of you and your constituents has not worked. There's a lot of discussion about it. I do hope that there'll be some progress there, but again, it's not really encouraging. I think the last thing I'll say is, and this is very much like the remarks before, at this point, it's more of blue sky thinking and trying to figure out how to use resources and programs that were already in place. So the ones like through the USDA that are opportunities that have been there. I think of it, the Fed, the Community Reinvestment Act, which has an opportunity to partner in community development. So there are programs we've had for a long time, and we're going to have to be able to leverage those. And then absolutely thinking about the private sector, both as a source of funds, but also it's so important to find ways to support your small businesses. If there are no jobs to go back to, it's not going to matter for the unemployed. So I do think there's a lot of problems. You all are extremely creative. Americans are scrappy people. We will get to the other side of this, but I do, So it's going to take a lot of work, but we'll get there.
So I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is I think your analysis is on the money. I also think that that these times of economic inflection, this inflection point that we're at, also opens the opportunity to have a different arrangement The last time we were in a dire situation like this was the Great Depression, and we were able to change some of the basic systems that created the middle class in this country and created the greatest economy in the world. So I think while we are at this nadir point, that there may be opportunities that exist in the existing flow, but there are also opportunities to rethink how we're doing this. In addition to that, I just wanted to give everybody, if you haven't went there, I suggest you go there to the website grants.gov, which might be able to help you sort through the various options that are out there. The federal government today is still spending money. So the flow hasn't stopped in terms of some of the ongoing programs like USCDA and others. So I would ask you to go to that website, look at it, look at the apps on there that might be able to help you to think about how you can use the existing structure to get there. I was just going to ask Ray, what were your thoughts about Claudia's statement?
Yeah, I mean, well, it was as dark as the clouds outside my house, but I get it, you know. And I'm not a macro economist, although I follow, you know, what's going on with the Fed. And again, in this moment of sort of trying to quote make it, you know, it just behooves us to think through what our strategies are. So I was on a call earlier the day with an organization that's called LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation. And they are a nonprofit financial intermediary that has brought in millions of dollars of private capital to be redistributed in communities. And one of the things that was heartening today to hear about what they're doing, and I'm sure you could go to their website, lisc.org, and look at these programs, but they actually have some programs where there are partnerships. And one I heard today was with Lowe's, for example, and Lowe's is gave them $60 million, and all of that money is to go out into micro grants for small businesses. So there's an opportunity because, again, you know, as was pointed out, you know, by Claudia, they're an important part of our economy. You know, the big companies, particularly in big tech, they're doing extremely well. So the bounce back is all going to be what happens with small businesses. So a lot of when I talk about having a strategy and focusing on what happens, one of the most important things is to put a laser beam focus on the health of those small businesses, because they are, in many of these towns, the primary driver of the economy. And so if they're not healthy, that economy is not going to do well, no matter how much government money. And so I've always looked at it that the government money matters, but we still have to attract other dollars. So again, my lens is always, what leverage can that community have, and how does it act as a magnet to bring other resources? Like when you look at the issue of broadband, you know, for example, you know, and there are some programs, you know, that were mentioned. One of the things that municipalities are uniquely positioned to do to attract capital investment is to function as an aggregator of demand and really think about how they can be a demand driver, creating a one-stop shop with all of their agencies, possibly bringing in the schools, possibly bringing in public housing, and putting that on the table. And then from an investment perspective, they're going to look at that and say, that makes sense for me to make a capital investment to bring broadband there. And then if you can marry that with some of the government programs on infrastructure. I also think that post-election, there is wide consensus. One of the few things that is bipartisan is I do believe there will be an infrastructure bill, and I do believe broadband is going to be addressed, because if you look at the entire side of the political spectrum, it benefits all sides, and everybody gets that, but neither party wants to give the other a win. Post-election, that kind of bill is going to happen. That's highly stimulative, because there are a lot of jobs associated with doing that kind of infrastructure in cities. But what it also does is it opens up new applications of technology, which create additional jobs.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying you can think about right now, but you also need to think about post-election and things may open up at that point.
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in preparing for that. And so when that window opens, and like one of the bills, again, in broadband that was getting a lot of currency is Congressman Clyburn put together a bill that it was drawing a lot of attention that focused both on the infrastructure side, but also very importantly on the demand side, which is the adoption side, and bringing resources to do that. Many of the smaller cities and the rural areas are going to be huge beneficiaries of that kind of effort, but they need to be positioned and they need to be thinking in advance, how would we utilize it, right? So broadband for the sake of broadband is not a game changer. But when you combine broadband with a strategy and a vision about what you're trying to do, and again, it also creates economic opportunities for the economically dislocated. We have always had more than 1 million plus jobs in this country that go unfilled. And many of those, a huge percentage of those jobs in the tech sector do not require college. And so we also have to rethink how we utilize the existing, and remember I said earlier, existing programs, repurposing those existing programs, how we think about utilizing them for where the jobs are moving to. So, you know, one of the things that COVID did is obviously it put a microscope, obviously tragically it's killed people, put a microscope on the disparities that exist with race and class. But the other thing it did was it rapidly digitized our society. And so we were told to work from home, play from home, school from home. So whether we wanted it or not, the digital age arrived at warp speed. So then if you're a city, if you don't have a strategy that internalizes that dynamic, you will be in trouble regardless of what happens with the government programs. So the positioning of where you are from a macro perspective with all of these externalities matters big time. And then there becomes winners and losers in that world. And the winners are the ones that are prepared, just like with companies. The companies that had digital strategies and understood the importance of appealing to consumers in a 24/7 way, they're thriving. The companies that were caught flat-footed, many of the smaller ones, or the Macy's of the world, or the others that were landlocked, they're in trouble. And so you've got to grab the externalities, you've got to internalize them, and then develop a strategy accordingly. You know, other than saying, "Oh my God," yes. Because the federal government has never been in a position to bail out, people ad infinitum. It's always been about the creativity of bringing together your assets, and the way Pittsburgh, repositioned itself when steel wasn't going to be king anymore, and then they created a dynamic city and they looked at their assets. One of the great success stories, and there are others.
So, Mark, what's your thoughts on this? You're obviously administering a current program. In the question of opportunities in your pipeline to assist in this time of crisis. What are your comments?
Well, yeah, that's it's definitely a challenge in a sense that some of our programs, of course, are based on history and some very I'm going to say prescriptive sense of what the programs are for, how they work, and really based on what has worked in the past. Sometimes it's hard to administer, especially a larger federal program, to be innovative and support creativity for the future. But I think we're understanding that and seeing some flexibility and opportunity to work forward. As we're speaking here, thinking about kind of what's changing, where are the challenges in our communities. I think, as expressed, some of the industries, some of our communities have adjusted, to the current activities. Others have not, in the sense of some industries and working forward, or some public services. You look at, we mentioned education, healthcare. What are those systems going to need, and what are they going to look like into the future? So I think some of our programs really need to take maybe another look at how we assist, rather than simply a large brick and mortar centralized facility. How can we support, maybe it's decentralization, or some type of distributed services, or supporting economies that are going in that direction. We've seen quite a bit of interest, especially around foods and other industries, on decentralizing, how to have more local systems that aren't dependent on outside sources. So I think it's going to be an interesting time to see how we can adjust to some creativity and innovation. I agree.
Yeah, yeah. So at one time, I was the head of the federal minority business programs, specifically the Federal Procurement Center here in DC. And, I learned some things in that experience. One, it's a different language. So when you apply for a grant with the federal government and you haven't had experience with it, you really, there are actually people that are specialists that do nothing but federal contracting and federal relationships, in part because the language is so specified. And one of the things that Ray raised, most things are done through an RFP process. And Ray had mentioned the points that folks get. Really, how you craft your proposal matters, meaning if you're crafting your proposal, and I used to be part of the CDFI fund as well. If you're crafting your proposal, you're in competition with a lot of other folks. So this point about really, one, getting to know and understand the language of who you're talking to, and then also being clear about getting those direct points. Fluffy language doesn't necessarily get you there. What gets you there is really being able to talk about your competitive advantage for the particular grant program. So those are just practical tips. And I just want to come back to Claudia because we're slowly advancing on time here. Claudia, given the dynamics, what do you think of this post-election idea that you had mentioned and Ray had mentioned as well? And how do you think cities should be positioning themselves vis-a-vis after the election?
Right. So now is absolutely the time to be thinking about what comes next year. And regardless of who ends up in the White House or in Congress, this is the time to plan, because I absolutely agree with you, Gary, that we need to go big. Like, February should not be the goal, right? In February, there were marginalized people and communities. I mean, the Flint, Michigans, the New Orleans, another community, they needed money and more support, right, at that time. And so we don't want to just get back to February. We want to get back to somewhere that is more prosperous, more shared prosperity. That is a tall order. Like, there was a reason we weren't in a better place even after a 10-year expansion. So, but you all out there have a lot of knowledge of what is missing, what is working in your communities, and there's an opportunity to actually help shape the agenda that could come out of DC. I spent a lot of time over the last several months working with staff on the Hill. Just like all of you have amazing staff supporting you, there are really good, sharp people in Congress assisting the members. Now, they need the technical assistance. I basically spend a lot of time doing spreadsheets and, talking points and, really explaining some of the nuts and bolts of economic policy and how to actually write it into legislative text. As everybody said here, when you're applying for grants, the details matter. That's absolutely the case when Congress is trying to put out a new program. And to Mark's point, like, if we are going to be creative, that is really hard. It needs to be simple, but it needs to be bold. That is not easy to do, and you all have a lot of knowledge about what a good outcome would look like. So there's need, but again, since the idea is to go big, that takes a lot of time, and it's like towards the end of September, right? So we have to keep the eye on the prize, and there's a lot of chaos and uncertainty going on in the world and a lot of rancor and unrest, but like, there is an opportunity, but it's an opportunity that we have to seize right now and try and build partnerships so that the information can get to the policymakers and we can do what needs to be done.
So given that this conference in part is about entrepreneurship, Ray brought up the issue of where entrepreneurs, what's going on right now with entrepreneurs. What kind of ideas or partnerships do you think that cities could actually do to help buttress the entrepreneurs in their community in relationship with the federal government? Are there programs? Are there other aspects of that? I know Ray mentioned lists. There's the Association of African American CDFIs. There's a lot of folks out there that are really trying to buttress not only African American businesses, but all businesses in this country. Do you have any final things that you say to cities about developing their ecosystems so that they're ready and prepared for when
Gary, that's a great question. And I guess at a broad level, I look at it, and as you can tell, even though I can be sharply critical, I'm still a glasses half filled person. Is that I think it's a unique opportunity to create a new table. And I use that analogy about getting the table right. Who's at the kitchen table with you in terms of planning? And like when you were talking about the entrepreneurs, a lot of times people don't ask the entrepreneurial community what's most important to them and what do they need most. And so it's a real opportunity when you have people at your kitchen table. You're not just talking, you're also listening. And so I think, understanding what's going on, it can help in the prescription. Sometimes it's like walking to a doctor and she's treating your leg, but it's your head that hurts. And so it's like, put the energy in the right spot. And again, I see some very interesting in some of the work that we're doing coming together of unusual combinations. And so I'm involved in a project in Detroit, and we have Ford Motor Company at the table with philanthropy, with the government, and we're thinking ahead about the fact that Ford Motor wants to move certain jobs into the heart of that city, but then in advance thinking about what does that mean for economic dislocation? What does it mean for gentrification with housing in advance? And then how do we take advantage of the whole supply chain that can benefit from those jobs? And so I often say to people, think about things so that things happen by design, not by default. And very often things just happen because we default our way into certain situations because there's no design. And so you can't design everything, but where we can apply our creative energies and the enormous talent, there's a lot of talent inside of government and real smart people, but very often the table is too narrow, or it's the very same people sitting at the table who were part of already making that city not function to its highest capacity. So how about changing up the table, inviting some different people in for the meal? That would be my answer.
That sounds great. So we got time for a last word for Mark and Claudia. Any last words?
So I just like to piggyback on what Ray said and come at it from a little different direction. I really think it's important for all of you to continue to invest in our future entrepreneurs. I know that some community colleges do amazing partnerships doing training for people that aren't going to go on and get a 4-year bachelor's degree. There are a lot of good jobs that can come with training. And I just know that that's an area, I mean, you all are facing an impossible budget shortfall, but it is important not just to think about this crisis, but what you look like 5 years, 10 years from now. And we absolutely need that next generation of entrepreneurs, and we need them to be trained well.
Mm-hmm. Mark?
I would just ditto. I think the last of comments of Ray and Claudia is just you're kind of looking back at where we've seen successes in communities and regions. I think the core key to those successes really are partnerships of those communities, the regions working together, really focusing on their assets and their competitive advantage, and really building on the assets that they already have, and through partnerships, and then engaging with other programs, federal programs, investor programs. So I think really focusing on that is a critical starting point for communities and regions.
Well, I want to say thank you. Thank you all for sharing your knowledge with us. And I also want to say thank you and turn it back over to Evan to close us out. Evan? Are you there?
Yep. Thanks, Gary. Appreciate it. Thank you, Ray and Claudia and Mark. I couldn't agree more with the general theme of the panel. We have said for years here at the conference that you have everything you need in a community to be entrepreneurial, to have an entrepreneurial ecosystem. and to build economic development around entrepreneurs, even the smallest communities. And I think that was reinforced with this panel, and it holds true today. We all know that support from Congress is not coming anytime soon, but hopefully over the last 45 minutes you've seen alternatives where you can engage the federal government and get support for what you're trying to do in your cities. So this marks the official end of the day. Tomorrow begins at 10 a.m. Central with an optional coffee hour to get together and commiserate a little bit starting at 9 a.m. Central. Right now we're going to head into a small break, but after that break there is an optional session with My Sidewalk, a Kansas City company that made data dashboards for your communities. If you want to go and learn how to access these data dashboards and tell your story like Ray suggested with data and have a narrative around your community using information and data that's readily available about your community, please join My Sidewalk here in a little bit. And other than that, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your work today. We deeply appreciate the work you are engaged in every day in your service to your community. And we will see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thank you.